and
Oh.
Commissioners. I'm Nancy Whelan, General Manager at Marin Transit. And tonight I will be going over our annual report. It's a little different this year for those of you who've been around before. In the past, we've outlined our achievements from the previous year and then outlined what we're going to be doing in the subsequent year, this year, and make our allocation request. And this time we're going to do a little differently because we've had a major pandemic. And so the first part of my presentation will focus on what we've been doing over the past 4 months. So next slide, please. Just very briefly, kind of how the FY 19-20 year went for us. We ended the year with about 2.7 million passenger trips, which is down about 15% due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We provided a rapid response to that. We continued essential services, but we did shift our focus from productivity, which we typically measure in passengers per hour as an example, to the new safety requirements that we were needing to put in place due to the pandemic. We were providing transportation in essential corridors. We focused on financial stability, and we did continue with our long-term capital and planning projects. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we did have a rapid response in late March when we first were under the shelter-in-place order. We had to cancel services to our schools and the Muirwood shuttle in cooperation with the National Park Service when Muirwoods closed. We also began to see very significant ridership decreases. We saw an 80% decrease on our fixed route service and an 84% decrease on Marin Access, which is our paratransit and other accessible services. We saw our contractors, all of our services are contracted. We have 4 different contractors, and 2 of our contractors in particular were facing furloughs of their employees. Whistle Stop, who provides our paratransit service, because the paratransit demand had been so diminished, was faced with potentially laying off drivers, as was MV Transportation. They are the provider of our supplemental school routes and Muirwood shuttle. At this time, we were also facing new safety requirements from the federal government, from state, and from our county. And we very quickly had to put operational policy changes into place and had to notify our riders of everything that was going on. So we were busy, very busy, responding to new orders, to new information, and best practices that we were learning about nearly daily or weekly. So next slide, please. During this time, we've continued to provide transit services to those who need it the most. That would be low-income riders, essential workers who are going to work, or people making essential trips. We continue to provide service to hospitals, healthcare centers, grocery stores, pharmacies, and the like during the shelter-in-place. We have maintained our core and lifeline services and will continue to do so as we recover. And we have provided our on-demand services, particularly our Connect service, which we've done in collaboration with TAM and Uber, that can provide a safety net in certain cases where other transit services are not available. Next slide, please. And as ridership was dropping, the impacts of the pandemic on the economy, of course, are being felt. And more than 60% of Marin Transit's operating revenue depends on sales tax-based revenues. And our FY 2021 budget projection, which was done back in April, showed a revenue loss of $4.8 million. And this slide just tries to help understand the magnitude of that drop. For us, that would mean something like the annual operating budget of our entire West Marin stagecoach service, plus the Muirwood shuttle, plus our supplemental school services. Or on the capital side, it would have meant the purchase of 49 paratransit vehicles or 5 electric buses. Next slide. We still have great revenue uncertainty. And to plan for that, we've been fortunate to have received CARES Act funding. We are planning for possible service cuts, however, and we will be taking budget updates and revisions to the Marin Transit Board as the economic picture clarifies. As somebody said, it's kind of a perpetual event for us to be monitoring and reporting back. Next slide. So a little bit about the CARES Act, and you heard about it earlier tonight. It's a $1.3 billion package of funding available to transit agencies in the Bay Area that MTC has allocated. It was distributed based on 5 principles around the notion of getting the money out there early, based on need as estimated by revenue losses, and by the by equity as measured by the percent of riders with incomes of less than $50,000 a year. MTC distributed the first phase of funding on April 22nd, and the second phase, as was mentioned, was just distributed or approved yesterday. For phase 1 and phase 2, Marin Transit received a total of $10.2 million. And that little spaghetti chart to the right is a list of all of the transit agencies who received funding under the CARES Act. And although we are very grateful for the additional funding, it really is a stopgap measure that allows us to some time actually to plan for an economic recovery and ridership recovery or changes that we will need to make to our service. And the federal government, in passing this act, only expected this to last through 2020. We are fortunate at Marin Transit that we'll be able to spread that out a little bit longer, and we don't expect any major service cuts this fiscal year, but we are going to begin planning for them for the future years. Next slide, please. The impact of the CARES Act on Marin Transit's operating revenue is significant. The title on this slide is wrong. It's actually the 2020-2021 operations budget revenue. And annually, we have about $35.1 million. What's different this year is the share of federal funding. With CARES Act, we have budgeted for 17% of our revenue from federal sources, which is primarily the CARES Act money. Just as an example, last year we had 5% in federal money. And the other differences, of course, are in the areas where we've had to see a decrease or planning for a decrease. That would be in the STA and TDA. So that's the kind of gold bars to the left there and the blue bar. Those are now about 16%, 15% of our budget, and last year they were 22%, so we've seen a drop there. And then Measure A and Measure AA was 39% last year and is now 35%. And in fact, we're very grateful to have that, and that's been able to be achieved because we've been able to carry forward prior year Measure A and also the release of the reserves. So this is the operating budget that was adopted by Marin Transit in June. Next slide, please. So that was, of course, a snapshot in time, and we understood in June, as we do now, that we need to continue to take steps to understand and improve the district's services and financial health. This is just kind of a listing of the things that we are paying close attention to and what we're trying to do. We are monitoring revenues and ridership, of course. We're reducing costs where we can. Our budget shows about $120,000 reduction in administrative costs over what we had planned initially. We are looking for cost efficiencies in other ways. We've made service adjustments that will take effect in September, and they will have minimal impacts to our passengers, but will save the district about $1.2 million. And we are developing operation scenarios to ensure that we continue to provide core lifeline services with the physical distancing requirements that we have. And right now, our biggest unknown on this list is how and when schools will reopen. Next slide, please. So turning to our ridership over the past 4 months, although ridership did take a drop by 80% initially, ridership has been slowly increasing since June, and we are now at about 60% of our normal ridership. So this chart shows ridership by week, so the weeks are across the bottom there, since the middle of March and ending at the end of June. The gray shaded area shows the average weekday ridership for 2019, so the average weekday ridership for a year before this. And the green bars show weekday ridership since the pandemic began, and the blue bars show the weekend ridership. And to kind of help you read what is on the other axis, that means that at this time last year, our weekly ridership was about 65,000 passengers, and now it's at about 25,000 passengers. So we are seeing a slight uptick, a growth back in our ridership. Next slide, please. The pandemic has prompted some innovative uses of our paratransit vehicles and drivers. Due to the extreme low demand for paratransit service and to our desire to retain our workforce, paratransit vehicles and drivers have been used for meal and grocery delivery and have been available if called upon by the County Office of Emergency Services. Additionally, we've implemented new safety protocols on paratransit because these riders tend to be the most at risk of contracting coronavirus. Under normal circumstances, we try to group rides for efficiency, but we are limiting the number of passengers on a vehicle to 1 or 2 due to this high-risk group. Next slide, please. So I mentioned physical distancing, and physical distancing on public transit is becoming a significant challenge, especially as riders are returning to our service. To achieve physical distancing, we are limiting our big buses to 9 passengers, and with only 9 passengers in a bus that seats 37, capacity is reduced by 75%. So what that means is that when a bus has 9 passengers on it and it arrives at a stop where passengers are waiting to board, they can't get on. So this results in what we call a pass up. And so the driver waves to them that they need to get the next bus behind. Next slide, please. Pass-ups reached an average of 40 per day in May. And in response to that, we added backup bus service, which is essentially a bus that trails the primary scheduled bus so that it can board additional passengers, those who would have been waiting. We'd started that on May 30th with an additional bus service through the canal on a loop, and then also serving the 101 bus pads and the Somerville Transit Center. And even with the added bus service, the number of passengers passed up at bus stop increased by 13% from May to June. In the month of June, more than 1,500 people were passed up due to bus capacity. Now, that doesn't mean they were completely stranded. It meant that they just got passed up and the next bus had to pick them up. What we've learned is that with the addition of the supplemental bus service at the beginning of June, the pass-up locations shifted from the majority of them occurring around the canal in May. That's what we were seeing. And in June, what we saw is that they were occurring more at Somerville Transit Center and on the bus pads and other locations. So basically, we've learned that the supplemental service in the canal is helping move passengers from the canal to the transit center, but passengers are experiencing pass-ups at the transit center while attempting to make connections to get to their final destinations. And secondly, the growth in ridership is just meaning that we are now experiencing pass-ups throughout the system more consistently. We're continuing to monitor these trends, and we are going to continue to adjust and add service as we can to address this pass-up activity. Again, all due to the restriction of keeping only 9 passengers to a bus for safe social distancing.
Wow.
So I'm going to shift gears here, and on the next slide, we'll talk a bit more about the allocation requests that you are considering today. The first category of our allocation request is for the local bus service, and we're requesting $9 million be allocated to that. This service is primarily focused on our local and basic trunk line routes and our community shuttles, and in the past has been on the Muir Woods shuttle. We did indeed cancel that service back in March, and very recently, in conjunction with the National Park Service, we've agreed that we will not reinstate that service, the Muir Woods shuttle service, this year. So this is we're going to focus our services on those core corridors that I mentioned, and try to, again, work within the constraints of how many passengers that we can carry on those buses. Next slide. School transportation, as you know, is a new category under Measure AA. We're requesting $1.2 million for this next year. And this category includes our supplemental school routes. That's our fixed route transit that serves schools at their bell times. It includes our youth bus pass program. And it also includes the yellow bus program, where we provide funding to 5 eligible yellow bus programs in the county, as well as the management that we provide to those programs. This category is our most challenging right now in terms of trying to determine what school service will look like and when it will start. So this amount of funding that we've requested here may not indeed be used, but of course we only we only actually get reimbursed for those expenditures that we have. And so we will continue to update you on anything we learn about school services. Next slide, please. Next category is rural transit. We're asking for a Measure A and Measure A allocation of $591,379. This is for our stagecoach service, the 2 routes that serve West Marin. This year, it's important to note that we are no longer using carry forward funds from Measure A, which we've been able to do in the past. And in fact, our rural service levels will be maintained, but we'll be doing that with a combination of our property tax receipts as well as our Measure A. So again, we were able to actually save up a reserve of Measure A in this category for several years, then spent it down for several, and we actually just recently spent that down. So that's our goal this year, is to continue to maintain that service. Next slide, please. The next category is seniors and people with disabilities. Those services are provided under the umbrella of Marin Access. It includes Paratransit, our volunteer driver program, Catch a Ride, which is the discounted taxi rides, travel navigators, and travel training. We're asking for allocations from both Measure A and Measure AA and Measure B. Here we're asking for $2 million in Measure A and $1 million in Measure B. These programs, some of the highlights for this year are that we are going to update the Transit Connect pilot program. As I mentioned before, that's it. We're doing that in collaboration with TAM and Uber. We're building a new program database to consolidate and streamline 6 databases into 1. And we are implementing the new low-income fare assistance program. So those are kind of our key objectives this year. Next slide, please. Turning to our capital program, we have a capital budget of $14.9 million for this fiscal year. We are requesting Measure A and Measure AA in an amount of $2 million. That funding is primarily to match federal funds that we have to replace paratransit vehicles and shuttles. We're going to purchase 16 paratransit vehicles, 9 shuttles. We also are going to continue with our real-time sign installation. We have about 15 locations where we're installing real-time signs. We have an annual bus stop maintenance amount that we use Measure A for. And then separately, we have funding that has been made available through Measure A for parking school buses. And we are still seeking the very elusive bus parking location for yellow school buses. What's not on this list and is not Measure A funded, but I thought I'd bring up just is that we are purchasing 4 more battery electric buses this year. So that's our capital program. And then turning to next slide. The summary of our allocation request. We won't read all of this. It's part of what you are considering as item 8B tonight. And it's a request for Measure A and Measure AA in the amount of $14.9 million, close to $15 million. And that consists of funding from the old Measure A, as well as reserves from the old Measure A, and then the new Measure AA Category 4. Next slide. And this is a summary of the Measure B allocation request, which is the item you'll consider under 8C on your agenda tonight, and it's for $1,075,000. And you can see here how we use Measure B. It's staffing for a mobility management program, supporting and enhancing our paratransit program, which includes the travel navigators, our Paratransit Plus program, which has been Catch a Ride and now under the Connect program, and then other smaller programs to provide mobility to seniors, including our travel training, a little grants program called Innovation Incubator, and our volunteer driver program. So that's a summary of our allocation requests. And next slide, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.